All right, AP Macro Unit 3, Determinants of Consumption. The determinants of consumption are current disposable income. So when your disposable income or YD increases, your consumption will increase because you have more money to spend on things. Interest rate, which is the cost of borrowing. So when interest rate increases, consumption is going to decrease because if you want to borrow money to buy something, it's going to be more expensive. Wealth, which is the value of stocks, bonds, and real estate assets. So when wealth increases, your consumption increases because you have more money to spend on things. Price level, which is the rate of inflation. And when price level increases, consumption decreases because it's more expensive to buy stuff. And finally, expectations of future income. If you think you're going to be making more money in the next few years, it's likely that your consumption is going to increase because you know you'll have more disposable income. Consumption math. Marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, is calculated by your change in consumption divided by your change in disposable income. Only your change in disposable income, not your total income. And your marginal propensity to save, or MPS, is your change in saving divided by your change in income. Every dollar earned is either spent or saved, which means that MPC plus MPS always equals 1. The multiplier effect means that any change in spending, so CIGNE, consumption, investment, government, and net exports, will lead to cumulative changes in spending. To calculate the spending multiplier, it's 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC, or 1 over the MPS. So the total change in spending is going to be your initial change in spending times your spending multiplier. Aggregate demand. The total amount of output, RGDP, or real GDP, that CIGNE, the factors of consumption, is willing and able to buy at a certain aggregate price level. It's always going to be downward sloping, just like demand. So if you have a change in APL, you're going to move along the graph, but if it's a change in CIGNE, it's going to be a shift of the graph. Here are the factors that shift aggregate demand. Fiscal policy, which is government spending. Increasing government spending will shift AD to the right, while decreased government spending will shift it to the left. Taxes. Increased taxes will shift AD left, while decreasing taxes shift AD right. And transfer payments. Increasing transfers will shift AD right, while decreasing transfers will shift AD left. Interest rates will also affect aggregate demand. So decreased interest rates will shift AD right because it's cheaper to borrow, and increased interest rates will shift AD left because it's more expensive to borrow. Short-run aggregate supply is the total amount of output that businesses can supply at different aggregate price levels. It's upward sloping due to sticky input costs. Changes in APL will move along the graph, but outside factors will shift the graph. Here are the factors that will shift short-run aggregate supply. Input costs. Increased input costs will shift short-run aggregate supply left. Better technology will shift it right. Government policy like subsidies and corporate tax cuts will shift it right. Wages like increased wages will shift short-run aggregate supply right. Productivity, if your workers are more productive, it'll shift aggregate supply right because they're able to make more. And inflationary expectations. If the business is expecting more inflation, then aggregate supply will shift left. If they expect less inflation, then it will shift right. Shocks, which are outside events that shift either AD or short-run aggregate supply. An example of this is a negative supply shock, and all that means is that you're going to shift aggregate supply left. Or a positive demand shock means that you will shift demand right. Here's a graph of AD and SRAS together, and the intersection between AD and SRAS is the actual GDP or equilibrium GDP of the economy. Long-run aggregate supply shows the potential GDP or PGDP of the economy, and when it shifts right, it indicates economic growth, while shifting left indicates economic contraction. The long-run aggregate supply is always a vertical line at the potential GDP. An economy is in long-run equilibrium when the eGDP is equal to the PGDP. So when the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is on the long-run aggregate supply curve, like in this graph shown. A recessionary gap is when an economy is below their full output, so their equilibrium GDP is less than their potential GDP. which means unemployment is higher, output is lower, and aggregate price level is lower. An inflationary gap is when the economy is above full output. So your equilibrium GDP or your actual GDP is higher than your potential GDP. This means that unemployment is lower, output is higher, and aggregate price level is also higher. Here are those different graphs on a PPC, or production possibilities curve. If a graph is at long-run equilibrium, then you're on a point of efficiency on the PPC. If you're in a recessionary gap, then you're going to be inside the curve because you're not employing enough workers, or you're not making the best use of all your resources. And if you're in an inflationary gap, you're going to be outside the curve because this economic condition isn't sustainable. Another term you have to know is cost push inflation, which is when supply side pressure causes an increase in APL, which will then cause inflation. It's also called stagflation, and it causes simultaneous inflation and unemployment. Demand pull inflation is when demand side pressure raises APL, which then causes inflation. So demand shifts right, which will increase price level and then cause inflation. There are 4 ways that the US manages its economy. Through fiscal policy, which is government spending, taxes, and transfers. Monetary policy, which has to do with interest rates and the amount of money, but we'll learn more about that in an upcoming unit. Supply side policy, which we'll learn more about in an upcoming unit. And self-correction, which is just an automatic adjustment that the economy makes to itself to restore it to long-run equilibrium. Self-correction works through changing input costs. If you're in a recessionary gap, then input costs are going to lower because it's easier and less expensive to make a business, which will shift short-run aggregate supply right and bring you back to long-run equilibrium. If you're in an inflationary gap, input costs are going to rise because it's more expensive and you have to pay your workers more. So short-run aggregate supply is going to shift left and bring the economy back to long-run equilibrium.